Hi class, this is lecture 25. So this is the second lecture in our online series. We're going to complete our discussion of valuation with a brief introduction to relative valuation. Now, relative valuation is a type of valuation where you value any asset based on similar or comparable assets in the market. So to do this, there's really three steps. The first is just to identify similar assets. So this means that, for instance, if you think about your parents' house, a comparable asset would be other assets, meaning other houses in the same neighborhood that are about the same size, have the same lot, etc. And then you're going to obtain market values for these assets. So you're going to try to figure out what is the recent price of those houses when they've been sold. The second step is to convert. You're going to convert these market values into standardized values. And the reason is because absolute prices cannot be compared. This process of standardizing creates price multiples. So for instance, let's say other houses around you are twice as large. In that instance, if you just try to figure out what the value of your parents' house is based on the nearby houses, right, you are going to estimate like a price that's twice as large as it should be because their houses are just much larger. So what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what is the price per square foot, right? That's going to give you a price multiple. It's going to give you, right, for a standardized value of the market. And then the third is to compare. We're going to compare the standardized value or multiple for the asset being analyzed to the standardized values for comparable assets. So we're going to compare our house again, its price per square foot, to other in the area. Now these are examples then of multiples. So for instance, the multiple I just went through was house price per square foot. When we're thinking in our class, we're going to generally be talking about stock prices. So we're going to be thinking, for instance, about PE ratios, right? The price to earnings ratio. An alternative is to thinking about the value per EBIT. So what is the value of the firm over EBIT? Or in other words, for $1 in income, what is the value of the company? Value over EBITDA or value over cash flow are pretty similar. We can alternatively think about book value of the asset. So for $1 of book value of equity, what is the price? Or for the total book value of assets, what is the value of the firm? We can alternatively be thinking about price or value per sales, right? Or assets or industry-specific variables, right? Certain types of industries and assets are going to have unique measures. So for instance, when we're thinking about houses, we would be thinking about the price per square foot. When we're thinking about the steel industry, we might want to think about the price per ton of steel. So as you can see, these are the first two steps, right? We're going to identify comparable assets, and then we're going to convert them into price multiples. So identify what the price or the value is of nearby assets, right? And then convert multiples by standardize them, right? So we're standardizing based on earning size. Some companies have a large earnings, some have small earnings, but per $1 in earnings, what's the price? Per $1 in EBIT, what's the firm value? We can be a little more explicit about this because some of you are actually going to use this in your jobs later on. So a more detailed definition is PE is generally considered to be the market price per share over earnings per share. Generally, when we think about price, we're going to think about current price, though at times some might use the average price for the last 6 months or the last year. EPS is earnings per share, generally the most recent financial year, alternatively the 4 most recent quarters, or expected EPS in terms of the next year or the next fiscal year. We can think about whether EPS is primary, diluted, or partially diluted, although in this class that's not important. Oftentimes people take this before or after extraordinary items. And also people try to use measuring this using different accounting rules. Now, for our purposes, none of this is going to be important. We're going to generally estimate price per earnings. And when we do this, we're going to use the current price, we're going to use the current earnings. But if you do this in the real world, you might have to think about some of these minor issues. Now, as you recall, we've talked about a few different types of valuation. right? So this is relative valuation. The value of an asset is based on what investors are paying for similar assets. So the value equals price over earnings. However, an alternative that we talked about in the last lecture and the lecture before that is intrinsic valuation. The value of an asset is a function of its fundamentals, right? So this is more the NPV kind of approach. We're going to figure out what are the cash flows each year, what is the growth expected in the future, and what's the risk or the discount factor. So these are actually two very different measures, as we can see, right? Are we defining value as a sequence of cash flows discounted back, or are we considering value as per $1 in earnings, what's the price of the share of the stock? What I want to point out is that in many ways, these are actually the same. And so this is a simple way to see this. Recall the dividend discount model. The dividend discount model says that the value of a given stock, so P0, is just going to be the sum of all the dividends from now into infinity. And if we think the dividends are going to grow at a constant rate, we can just take the dividend per share, right, in the first year, which would also be the dividends per share at time 0 multiplied by 1 plus g over r minus g, right? So we have a growing perpetuity that's going to pay dividends each year. It's going to grow at a certain rate g. If we divide both sides by the earnings per share, on the left-hand side, we now have the PE ratio, price at time 0 over earnings per share at time 0. If we look at the right-hand side, what we're going to have is actually the payout ratio multiplied by 1 plus g over r minus g. In order to get this top part of the fraction, what we're doing is we're taking dividends per share at time 1 is going to be equal to dividends per share at time 0 multiplied by 1 plus g. Then when we divide earnings per share, we're actually going to be given the payout ratio. The payout ratio is just dividends per share over earnings per share. In other words, for every $1 in earnings, how many are you paying out in dividends? Now this actually looks a lot like our calculations that we've done previously with intrinsic valuation. So we have actually, what we're saying here is that the PE ratio equals a growing perpetuity. And it depends on the payout ratio, the discount rate, or the risk, and G, the growth rate. So if the market is correctly pricing the asset, so if P0 is correctly priced based on the payout ratio, G, and R, then the two valuation methods are actually equivalent. They're actually measuring the same things. The difference here really is that in the intrinsic model, we are specifying what the growth, the discount rate, and the cash flows are. In the PE ratio, we're kind of letting the market do the work for us, right? Based on the price, we should actually kind of be able to estimate implicitly, right, the growth R and the cash flows. Now we have to assume that the market's pricing this correctly, but if so, then in a way we're kind of cheating off the market. And we can actually see this not just with PE ratios, but with other types of ratios as well. So each type of ratio can largely be written as a growing perpetuity with some cash flow, some R, and some G. We will not use much of these for most of our class. We're primarily going to focus on the PE ratio. But again, I just want to point out that if you use these in the future in work, all of these are actually just a form of intrinsic valuation where the market is kind of doing the work for you. All right, so here's two different questions. Again, I suggest you pause here and try each question for yourself. In the first question, we need to estimate the fair PE ratio for a national city according to its fundamentals. The idea is based on the prior two formulas. So if we look here, the PE ratio should be the payout ratio multiplied by 1 plus G over R minus G. If that's the case, we first need to estimate what is the payout ratio. The payout ratio is going to be 1.06, which is dividends per share, divided by 240, which is earnings per share. That gives us the payout ratio of 44%. For every $1 in earnings, about 44 cents is going to be paid out in dividends. The second step is to figure out the G. And we're looking at, it's expected to grow 6% a year starting this year. So that's the G. And then we finally need to figure out what is R. And as we see, the treasury bond rate was 7%, the equity risk premium is 5.5%, the beta is 1.05. If that's the case, we can actually then estimate what is R? So R is going to be 7% plus 1.05 multiplied by 5.5%. That's going to give us 12.775%. With this information, we can then estimate what is the fair PE ratio. Now I say fair because this is fair according to its intrinsic fundamentals, right? So according to our estimates about the growth rate, the cash flow, and the discount factor, we can back out the PE ratio. The PE ratio, like I said before, is going to be the payout ratio of 44% multiplied by 1 plus G, where the G is 6%, divided by the discount factor minus G. And if we do all this with a discount factor of 12.775% and a growth rate of 6%, we should be left with a 6.91 PE ratio. So that's the fair ratio. For every $1 in earnings, we expect about a 7-cent price. Next, the second question is, what is the long-term growth rate implied in the firm's current and actual PE ratio? So what this is saying is, what is the growth rate implied by the actual PE ratio, which we estimated as 10? And we're able to get 10 because, as you can see here, the stock traded for 10 times earnings. So if you plug in the formula that we just used and solve for G, where the actual PE ratio is 10, you're going to back out an applied growth rate. And that implied growth rate is going to be 6%. So again, going through these different steps, estimate the payout ratio. So this is going to be dividends divided by earnings. You're going to estimate the growth rate of 6%. You're going to figure out what is the cost of equity. And we're using cost of equity because we're thinking, again, about payout specifically to equity holders, right? So that's why this is not the weighted average cost of capital. So use the CAPM formula, risk-free rate plus beta multiplied by their equity risk premium, and then plug all this in to figure out what is the fair PE ratio. Next, we're going to estimate the actual PE ratio of 10. Plug this into the equation and solve for G. And what this is saying is that according to the market, the implied growth rate is actually 8%. This concludes lecture 25.